Thank you for joining Pluralist Points. Today, I'm speaking with Shira Hoffer. Shira is a student at Harvard University and very involved in mediation and dialogue. She is the founder and executive director of the Institute for Multipartisan Education, which seeks to support educational institutions to engage in curious and constructive disagreement. Shira, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. We'll just delve right in. Now, it's really impressive what you've done building this organization. You launched, as I said, Institute for Multi-Party Education when you were, was it a sophomore or
A
freshman?
junior.
You were a junior. Wow. First, tell us what this institute is and what was the motivation for it?
Yeah, so thanks again so much for having me on the show. The Institute for Multipartisan Education is a 501c3, which works with middle schools, high schools, and universities to broadly promote curious engagement across polarization. So we do that through working with middle and high schools in a consulting capacity, however that might best support the school. So that might look like workshops for students. It might look like working with administrators. However the school wants to see change, we try to support that in a grassroots way. And then we have a fellowship for college students where we have our own college students running a fellowship for their own peers, where the goal is to use a train the trainer model to support the infusion of curiosity into places where people already have trust. So they're student organizations, largely speaking, and bringing in those ideas into the student organizations in the first semester. And then in the second semester, having those students create a capstone project for the broader university. So we're really excited to pilot that in the fall with Elon University, actually, and go from there.
Great. So can you walk me through what the experience of someone who wants to be a part of this work, who wants to, maybe be a fellow, what is the experience like? Like, what do they have to do when they say, okay, I'm interested? They reach out to you, and then what happens?
Yeah, so we'll work with the team at Elon. It will be restricted to Elon for the fall, and then hopefully we'll grow to more universities going forward. But eligible students are student organization leaders who want to bring more curiosity to their student organization. So we're thinking of it more as a life skill, not as like you guys want to debate abortion, like you guys want to debate gun control, let's come together and do it. That's amazing too. But we're thinking about how can curiosity, curious engagement with difference be part of everyday life. So the students will come to a 3-day retreat where our staff members who will be students will teach them kind of why it's really hard to engage curiously, why it's important nonetheless, and how we can do it. That's kind of our 3-pronged model. And we're drawing on insights from psychology research, from pedagogy research that we've done over the summer, really trying to understand what is the kind of fundamental intellectual underpinnings of curious disagreement work. So we'll teach them kind of both what we're calling the skills and the disposition to approach difference with curiosity. And then they'll work with mentors, our student staff, to come up with some program. So for example, like to make it a bit more tangible, the head of the student newspaper might apply to be a fellow and notice that they're having a hard time conducting interviews with more conservative, members of society because they aren't coming up with the best questions. So they might run a program based on what we've taught them for their interview staff, to help their interview staff ask better, more interesting, more curious questions. And that kind of brings this idea of curiosity toward difference into the organization by somebody who they trust already.
Right.
And they'll spend the first semester creating that program with our support. And then we'll do a second retreat in December. And then the group will work together to create a capstone project for the university. So they know the university best. Maybe everybody loves field days at that university, right?
Yeah.
So can we create a field day around curiosity to really make these ideas feel tangible and exciting and meaningful?
I see. Very, very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. Now, I imagine that when you went to college, starting this organization may not have been on your radar. What were you looking forward to when you started as a freshman?
Yeah, and the story arcs quite nicely from that question to this conversation. So I'm glad you asked. I came from a small Jewish high school, and which had a focus on pluralism. So we focused a lot on, some of us might be more traditionally observant and some of us might be less, but we're all one community and let's learn about each other's differences and build community together. So coming into college, I was like, it's going to be like my high school, but on steroids. It's going to be all these different people, all living together, learning together, engaging with each other's differences. I think I was a little bit starry-eyed in retrospect. And it was challenging. I think it seemed to me that not as many people as I was hoping were really excited to get into these difficult issues of disagreement. And I had a few experiences where I was asking really tough questions and kind of alienating people, professors and other students actually. And that led me to get involved in the mediation world. So I mediate in small claims court, as you mentioned, and have done other dialogue fellowships throughout college, all kind of leading up to October 7th, which was a moment in time, right?
Mhm.
And a moment which inspired the founding of this organization.
I see. For most outsiders who don't know much about what happens on a campus like Harvard, can you provide your original thoughts on what it's like on campus in the context of free speech?
Yeah, I think, first of all, I would say that it is not as scary or cutthroat or terrible as the media has painted it to be.
Hmm.
We've had a lot of cameras on campus this past year, a lot of requests for comments from students.
Yeah.
And usually the students who want to comment are the ones who really have something to say. So the perception then is that everybody really has a strong opinion on what's happening. And I think that's true. There's a lot of people who are feeling stifled. Right now, a big thing that's going on is these library sit-in protests where folks are ostensibly adhering to the rules of the library, sitting quietly and studying, but doing so with signs on their computer protesting the war in Gaza. And there's a question as whether whether they've been kicked out of the library for doing so. Is that a free speech violation? How does that fall into kind of Harvard speech codes? And I think this has really been all over the media. I haven't seen it. I have not seen one person do that. So I think it's an interesting juxtaposition where you can just be living your life on campus and going to class and doing your homework, or you can be really involved in these conversations. And I think it's really up to you. But I would say that it is not the crazy cesspit of screaming people that the media has sometimes painted it to be.
Yeah. Now, oftentimes, and I think that we see this in surveys as well, that students are self-censoring,
Mhm.
especially on difficult topics. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah, I think that that's true. I certainly don't think that it's everyone, and it is certainly not all the time. But I was in a class, for example, my sophomore year about religion and Western democracy, and I was one of two religious students in the class. And I remember she and I would text each other in class, like, "Do you want to defend this point? Do you want to jump in on this one?" And we very much were in the minority. And there were days where we're like, you know what, it's, we're just too tired, we're not in the mood. So we would not push back on points that people would make. We weren't the scared type. We were the type to not want to bring it up because we were worried about it. But sometimes it just gets exhausting. And there are definitely, like, I sympathize with the people who are nervous about what might happen to them when they speak. And I remember, like, a notable time my freshman year, I was in a class and the whiteboard said how to dismantle the university system. That was the topic of the day. And so we started talking about it. And I'm sitting there, I was 18 years old. And I was like, I'm confused why we're dismantling the university system in the first place. I raised my hand and asked the question, and everybody just looked at me, like, just stared at me. And I was like, oh no, I said something wrong. But I didn't know what it was. And so we kind of like moved on. It was kind of awkward. And then afterwards, I went to the professor and I said, hey, I'm still curious about this. Something weird clearly happened when I raised my hand. Do you have any insight? And she explained to me that this was a class that was typically a safe space for students who had experienced, as she called it, racism and homophobia in other classes like economics and government. That's
Mm.
from her. And so we don't ask questions like that in this class. And I'm still like sitting there with my mind spinning, like, I'm not trying to be provocative. I fundamentally didn't understand why we were doing this. And I think that's a good example, is like there's all of these kind of piles of layers of assumptions of, you ask a question, but how could someone interpret it and what could it mean? And that's important. Like, in society, we have to be really careful. What is the impact of our words? And sometimes it makes it really hard to just ask basic questions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So Yuval Levin, in his book A Time to Build, talks quite a bit about, college and universities and how things have changed over the years. And he says that, it used to be that, we thought that college would do, about some three things, right? The first is a sense of professionalism. You learn a craft or some kind of a discipline that will inform your career path. So, whether it's architecture or computer science or what have you, right? That's an important part of it. You also get a sense of some kind of moral reasoning in college. You get a sense of how the world works in terms of what might be right, what might be wrong, and so on. And then the third thing is you learn, sort of the traditional liberal arts where it's like critical thinking and you challenge, you push back, and so on. And he says that it seems as though that middle part, the moralizing of things, of issues, has become sort of the predominant aspect of college and university. I wonder if you recognize that in your experience, or you might say maybe just a little bit of each.
So to clarify, his suggestion is that colleges are focusing too much on imposing a moral system on their students.
Right.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think it's that dystopian. I wouldn't say that there's like an imposition. I think there is definitely a dominant narrative of kind of a liberal progressive system. A hand in a class about, women and gender issues and say, here's why I think that abortion should be illegal. I would definitely get funny looks and funny comments from folks. But I think that there's still a spark of hope there. I think that conversation actually, as long as the professor was kind of on top of it, and I think most of them are, I think that that comment would be entertained. I think there is still room for that intellectual exploration if you kind of go for it. But you have to be the person who kind of goes for it and tests ideas and uses, your own personal bravery to explore those ideas. I think it is less brought out by peers. There's less kind of devil's advocate. There's less even folks who actually believe it. Doesn't have to be devil's advocate, right? It could be someone who really believes something that's in the minority position. You just don't hear it a lot. And I don't think that it's like the administration or the faculty conspiring to impose morals on students. I think that there's just less excitement, both with faculty and with students, about, how can I really challenge my own views? Like, that's a question I ask myself every day. What can I do today to challenge my own perspective? And I think if more people were to ask that question, then those conversations would be entertained. But the status quo is kind of, let's go with what's comfortable.
You ask yourself the question, what can I do to challenge my own views? What is it about you that makes you want to do that, right? Is there something about your personality that makes you want to do that? Because I imagine that not everyone walks around thinking that way, right?
I think that's probably true. I think one aspect is just like I kind of fell into this work and became passionate about it. And so it's very much on my mind that my views aren't challenged very often in class, just by nature of the fact that I'm a liberal who happens to agree with most of campus on most issues, though with notable exceptions. I also think this is kind of a funny story. My family is really good at conflict resolution, and we used to have these family meetings where we'd all sit around a bowl of M&Ms and like discuss problems we were having. And there was a notable moment where my brother, when he was like 8, came to the meeting. I was 12, with a list of 17 things that he didn't like about me. And we went through that list as a family, and some of the things like I don't like the way Shira laughs is not something that was up for conversation. But like, I don't like that Shira makes fun of me in the mornings before I go to school. Was like, okay, Shira, like you got to change your behaviors. I think I've like grown up in a system where conflict resolution and like new perspectives is really important. So maybe it's predisposed.
That is fascinating. Did he feel as though the issues that he brought forth were eventually resolved?
I hope so.
Now, the story that you kind of talked about, that the one in your class about dismantling, at the university, is one that you highlight in your thesis as well, that you're working on. What have you discovered in your research as you've been working on your thesis?
Yeah, so my senior thesis is about how religious and secular students approach controversial issues on campus, or rather, what is their speech behavior patterns around self-censorship on campus. So I did a survey through the prolific survey system, which allowed me to gather a somewhat representative sample, though the N is just putting all these precursors out there at the beginning. The N was about 428. It was nationally representative on gender and age year in school, but there were all sorts of things that it wasn't. And most of the findings were not statistically significant. Now, given all of those caveats, which I think are pretty standard for a senior thesis where you don't have $250,000 to spend on the creation of a survey, I found some really interesting information, which largely speaking showed that it's actually religious students who are more interested and more capable of engaging with perspectives that they might not hold. So I measured 5 different categories: self-censorship. Gosh, now you're going to have me remember them off the top of my head. Self-censorship was definitely one. Positive engagement with new perspectives, playing devil's advocate, whether or not you shout down speakers that you disagree with, and maybe punishment of others for their speech. I think that was the 5th one. So on 4 out of those 5 categories, religious students demonstrated either less self-censorship, more willingness to engage, less likely to punish others for speech, and more likely to play devil's advocate. The 5th one was that they were actually more likely to shout down speakers than secular students. And I think that's surprising to a lot of people that I tell about this work. There's kind of this notion that religious is and then fundamental and traditional and therefore kind of closed-minded. But I think that, and the thesis argues that there's something about the way that we conceptualize a public-private divide in society, kind of this deliberative Democrat model, where we, in order to reach consensus, have to separate the private from the public. There's this notion that leads to better engagement, but I think that the findings of these surveys, which I think that the statistical insignificance is due to a small sample size and not due to an incorrect conclusion, suggest that we need to rethink the way that we engage in society and maybe shift our goal, I argue, toward mutual understanding as opposed to consensus, and that we can use a blurring of the public-private divide to come to that mutual understanding, which will lead to more consensus, but also lead to healthier relationships and reduced polarization.
I see. Fascinating. Now, do you have, friends on all sides of issues? Like personally, do you cultivate that?
I try to. I think there's something interesting about being a religious Jew on a liberal campus, because a lot of my religious friends are also conservative, like American political conservatives. I'm not. And so I have a lot of also secular friends and religious and Jewish friends as well who are more liberal like I am. But then because of the space that I pray in every week, right? A lot of those folks disagree with me on a lot of issues. And it's an interesting kind of, we're all tied together by the same religion, but we also very much disagree on a lot of other issues.
I see now. So with your religious friends, do you see your research reflected in the way that you sort of engage with each other? Like, are they more willing to play devil's advocate? Are they more likely to shout down speakers and so on and so forth?
That's an interesting question. Well, I have been to a protest, a silent protest of a speaker that I disagreed with, where the folks who were disagreeing were religious Jews, and nobody shouted him down. So I thought that was impressive. I think shouting down speakers is not the best way to engage. And I'm not sure. I've never really conducted social science research on my friends. I mean, the ones that and maybe this is a selection bias, but definitely the folks that I'm friends with will have conversations, especially around the election, of, you'll say, oh, well, Trump will be better for Israel. And some of them will be single issue voters and therefore vote on that topic. And I've had some interesting conversations with them to say, okay, maybe he will be better for Israel. What about these other issues? How are you thinking about kind of the holistic picture of somebody being the president as opposed to a single issue? And we've had, productive conversations on that topic.
I see. In what ways do you think the election is shaping campus behavior lately? Obviously, it's only been about a week or so, but how is that being experienced on campus?
So and this was a mistake on my part, I was away from campus Wednesday and Thursday of last week, so I missed the immediate aftermath. I was running a training through the Institute in California. I think there was a lot of frustration from my conservative peers that some professors canceled class. They thought that was not an appropriate use of, I don't know, professorial discretion at the schedule. That, like, what if somebody's really elated? Like, why should you cancel class for them? I think The general vibe, though, is like to not talk about it. It came up at dinner the other day, and someone was like, "Oh, do we have to talk about the election?" I think like people are pretty tired of the topic, and there's a sense of like, especially among the liberals, like inevitability and maybe a sense of doom that
Mhm.
their candidate that didn't win. Um, I would love to like go around interviewing people and being like, "What do you think and why?"
Mhm.
But I don't know that I have the time. Also,
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Now in the aftermath of October 7th, you did some work on campus. You had a hotline that folks could sort of reach out to. Can you tell me more about that?
yeah, so basically, and this is I'm glad you asked because that's kind of fills in the loop to how we got to the institute now. Um, the way that Harvard communicates is through email listservs on dorms, and so there was a message that had come out clarifying that Harvard's position was that Hamas is a terrorist organization, and some of my peers wanted to share that message with the community via dorm listserv. So somebody asked me if I would forward the message to my dorm. This was October 9th. And so I was worried that anything I said on the topic would lead to some sort of reputational damage by somebody who wanted to assume something about what I thought. And so I said, fine, I'm happy to forward the message along. But in my email, I said, hey guys, passing along a message. Here's what it is. By the way, my background is in mediation. I've done these dialogue fellowships and I actually know a lot about this conflict. It's really complicated, really difficult, really emotional. Here's my cell phone number. If you have any questions, I'm happy to have a conversation. And I figured if I include my cell phone number and an open offer for a conversation, nobody can judge me for being closed minded. Nobody can say I'm unwilling to talk. I've kind of blown that argument out of the water. And
Mhm.
that was kind of that. But then throughout the day, I was getting inundated with all these questions from people that I didn't know. Hey, Shira, this is John. Hey, Shira, this is Kate. I have this question. The first question was, what's the best solution to the Israeli-Palestinian
Oh
conflict?
boy. Yeah.
And I was like, oh boy,
That's a big one.
that's a big one. And so I turned it into a national hotline, texting hotline that still runs. You could text it right now. It's staffed by our volunteers who are committed to responding to questions with a range of perspectives and resources to back them up. So if somebody said, what's the best solution? We might say, here are 3 big solutions that have been proposed in the past. Here are some articles in favor, and here are some articles against. Why don't you take a look and get back to us? We're happy to have a conversation. And the idea was to have a place where people could really express that genuine curiosity that I was seeing that sometimes we don't see in the classroom or in social settings with the anonymity that comes with it and be able to get a bunch of resources to learn for themselves. And we're totally apathetic to the conclusion that the person comes to. We just want that conclusion to come from something more than the photo they saw on Instagram last week, which suddenly made them experts in the Middle East. And so this hotline is still running. We've answered hundreds of questions from across the country. But I realized, and this is just to quickly draw the link, so I realized that this is a great resource for people who have questions. But the people that I'm more worried about are the people who don't think that they have any questions at all. Um, and those are the ones for whom I founded the Institute for Multipartisan Education based on a text from a teacher that I got asking if we could support some work they were doing in their school, launching this organization to promote curiosity, to help people who think that they don't have any questions realize that there's actually so much to learn.
Interesting. Now, would you what are the common threats of the questions that you get from through the hotline? Is it a sense of fear, a sense of uh just anger? Is it confusion? What are you getting from these messages?
Yeah, there have been like different waves of questions. Right now, folks have been pretty dormant, which is fine. I think there's a lot of exhaustion on the topic in the US, which makes sense. Um, at first, there were a lot of factual questions. Why is Israel in Gaza? What does Israel have to do with Gaza? What is this I hear about water supply? What are these checkpoints, etc.? And this has been interesting, it's kind of morphed into into like an emotional support hotline, which we
Mhm.
tell people like we wish we could do this, but we are not licensed to, mental health counselors, etc. But people will say like, I have a cousin, I have a sister who thinks this and I think that, and I don't know how to empathize with them. I don't know how to engage. I don't know what to do, and we'll try and support them. But it's been interesting that there's been this shift from like, I want to understand the situation, and we still get questions like that, to like, help me handle the interpersonal aspect of this conflict as well.
Yeah. Has going away for the summer, has that been helpful in terms of calming things down on campus?
That's interesting because I was also away. I keep missing out on things. Really, I was abroad last spring, so I missed the
Mm,
encampments altogether.
I see.
So I hadn't been on campus for 9 months. It was calmer than I expected in the fall. I really thought we were going to be met with waves of protests on different sides, and really there have been a few. But it's mostly been pretty quiet. I'm not really sure why. I'm not sure. I mean, there was kind of the momentum of last spring, right? That got
Mhm.
cut off. There are definitely still folks who are passionate on both sides of the issue. But it has been less public.
Yeah. So you have centered curiosity, in your work with the Institute and maybe the hotline as well, because you're encouraging people to be curious about what's
Yeah.
happening. Tell me more about that. Like, why is curiosity so important to you? Why do you find it to be sort of the core of, when it comes to issues related to, dialogue and civil discourse?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. I think curiosity, I don't think that it's a silver bullet, but I think it's pretty close to helping
Yeah.
resolve polarization and also helping to strengthen relationships. I think originally the reason I came up with the slogan "Disagree curiously" was because it struck me that a lot of the terms that have been thrown around, like civil discourse or free speech, they're coded in ways that people have kind of immediate reactions, whether positive or negative. And I wanted to found an organization that nobody would have a preconceived notion about. And I was like, okay, curiosity is a cool idea. Like it evokes a child blowing a bubble and being like, wow, there's like
Mhm.
that awe factor that comes with curiosity. But then over the summer, when I brought on some folks to do some research into curiosity itself, it turns out that it's an amazing trait or state or way of operating in the world that helps to combat a lot of the neurological, cognitive, social, and moral factors that make disagreement or make engagement with hard ideas really so challenging. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest, and I'm happy to talk about it, that the brain and the way that we've structured society are working against us, making it really, really hard to build bridges and to depolarize, but that curiosity can come in and, when expressed the right way, really start to break down some of those barriers.
I see. In all of your work doing this in mediation and civil discourse and practicing all of this, what have you found to be the most useful skill or maybe the most useful tool to bring down the temperature of a heated conversation?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple. One, if we're talking about really bringing down the temperature, I think silence is actually
Mm.
super powerful.
Yeah.
That in mediation, sometimes the parties will be really heated
Mhm.
and we'll just count to like seven and
Mhm.
not say anything. And everyone looks super confused and it feels super awkward. But suddenly, when you start talking again, you can speak at a much lower volume and it's like a reset. And in conversations with people, if you're really getting frustrated and then you just stop for a second and maybe you're taking a deep breath or maybe you're formulating a question, just taking a beat to not say anything can have a huge kind of calming, depolarizing effect on an individual conversation. Another trick that I really like is, and this one I'm sure people have heard, is like reflecting back,
Mhm.
clarifying that you understand, saying, if I understand you correctly, this is your position, right? And when somebody feels understood, they're much less likely to continue screaming in your face because they're like, oh,
Mhm.
yeah, they got it, and
Yeah.
then that can calm things down. And the third one, and I remember exactly where I was when I learned this trick, there's a big difference between do you think and don't you think. Both
Mhm.
of them are questions. They're very similar words, but
Mhm.
actually, do you think is an open-ended, like I'm curious to, you could translate it to like I'm curious to learn more. Whereas don't you think is actually an accusation with a question mark at the end of it, right? And so if you're
Yep.
having a conversation about the election, you say, well, don't you think that Trump just wants to harm immigrants? Versus, do you think that Trump wants to harm immigrants? Those are very different questions and portray very different kind of levels of respect for the person that you're talking to. And so the ability to reframe questions as more positive, more curious, can take a very heated conversation and very quickly turn it into a more curious one.
Mm. Is there anyone that you look up to in this space? Anyone whose work you think of as a model for advancing, pluralism, civil discourse, or anything like that?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, there's so many coming into the space. Um, w- I feel like it's unfair to name one group because I'm going to be leaving out the rest. I guess one that's close to my heart is Interfaith America
Mhm.
organization, who's turning now toward bridge building more broadly. I had the chance to speak at their conference over the summer with
Mhm.
Manu Meal, who's the founder of Bridge USA. And just like being in that room of students who come from ostensibly really different backgrounds and backgrounds that against each other have caused like wars across the world, and talking with Manu about the power of bridge building and student leadership was really, yeah, an inspiring moment.
I see. Wonderful. Are you optimistic that this kind of work will gain traction across Harvard and across other colleges around the United States?
Yes. I mean, first of all, I can't not be, right? Otherwise, I would just not get out of bed in the mornings. But I think the answer is yes, and I think maybe because it has to. We're kind of if it's true that the majority of colleges lean liberal, then the majority of the college population is going to be in opposition to the US government for the next 4 years. And if we're gonna not just like hide in a hole and dig deeper into polarization, then we have to approach these things with curiosity. And I've seen it happen. I mean, I've seen students who really disagree with each other sit down and have conversations. It's not impossible. We just, I think, and for folks who are feeling really hurt by the election, maybe we need some more time to kind of grapple with the current reality. But then I think we're going to have to pull it together and be like, okay, this is what more than half of the country wanted. So how can we understand that better? And how can we build bridges with these people, even if we really strongly disagree?
Yeah. What's the common critique you hear about this kind of work? Is it that people say, it's just not going to work? Or, what do you hear more often?
There's a bunch of them. It's a good question. I think the more radical critiques, especially from the left, are like it's immoral to sit down with somebody with whom you disagree so strongly, somebody who holds an abhorrent position. You're
Mhm.
platforming them, you're giving them a chance to influence the world with their perspectives in a way that you shouldn't. Um, I would suggest to that, for example, that like Nelson Mandela sat down with all sides and had,
Yeah.
closed door conversations to resolve apartheid in South Africa. And so this
Mhm.
idea that like having conversations is counterproductive to creating justice, I think is not true. Um, there's a critique that it can promote hate speech. I think that I would have the same response. Those are kind of coming from the really, far progressive left. On the right, I think there's more of a, this is never going to work, or like I think a feeling of pain also that there's been such rhetoric, especially about Trump supporters, that they're, misogynist and racist and horrible people with no morals. And when you say all these things about a group of people and then you walk into a room of them and you're like, hey, do you guys want to talk? You haven't built up the trust to have that conversation. And so there's kind of a dismissal, like a, you don't respect me, so I don't respect you. So one thing that's nice about this work is if you get hate from both sides, you got to be doing something right. But there are definitely different challenges that need to be addressed on both sides to kind of bring people toward this type of engagement.
Yeah. Now, there's a reason that your institute is called Institute for Multipartisan Education, and I understand you have an issue with bipartisanship. So, tell me more about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. Somebody actually the other day asked me if I meant to be advocating for like a multi-party system of US government. I
Hmm.
don't know enough about that issue to know how I feel. What I take issue with in terms of bipartisanship is that it suggests that there are two sides. And when there are two sides, it's one against another. It's us versus them. It creates
Right.
kind of this dichotomy that I really think is false. I think most people that I know have nuanced views on different issues that actually aren't just, the laundry list of Republican or the laundry list of Democratic causes. I think, I uh, am more sympathetic to religious freedom arguments than a lot of Democrats, but I'm more sympathetic to to pro-choice arguments than a lot of Republicans. And if you ask me about any of my friends, I could probably name an inkling that they have on one side and the other, which makes it such that just dividing it into a binary forces people to neglect that nuance or just to ignore it all together and to adopt really hard-line positions. And I think by saying multipartisan, we're suggesting that actually there's more than two sides. There are multiple ways to engage that all have validity.
Yeah. So what's next for Shira? I mean, what's going to happen with the hotline, and where does the institute go from here?
Well, God willing, in 6 months I'll graduate from college.
Mhm.
That's the first step. From there, my plan is to run the institute full time as its executive director, and to continue this work. I'm not sure if we'll end up focusing more on college or more on middle and high school. We're kind of trying to pilot both of those programs now and see what gains traction, what feels productive. The hotline will continue to run. It's been tricky running both. If anybody's listening and they're like, dang, I really want to run that hotline, I really want to work on it, definitely reach out to me. We could use some extra hands. But assuming that we can, raise the staff and raise the support to continue this work, then my plan is to do it, as long as I can.
Excellent. What's your major?
Social studies and religion.
Fantastic. As we bring this to a close, what's your call to action? Like, what do you want folks to do after listening to your thoughts, your experiences on campus?
I think the best call to action is to start wondering why a little bit more and not facetiously. That if you hear something that you're like, nobody could ever think that. I can't imagine how a reasonable person would think that. Try to shift that in your mind and think, why might a reasonable person think that? Or what do I have to learn from a person who thinks that? I think a really important takeaway is that curiosity doesn't require the willingness to change your mind. I, for example, am really curious when people assert that, Jews are bad for society. As a Jew, I'm never going to change my mind on the perspective that Jews are not bad for society, but I'm curious to understand why they think that. And I think that example is really important to illustrate the fact that you can be really, really curious about why somebody voted for somebody that you didn't, or why somebody supports a policy that you don't. And you're not opening yourself up to that vulnerability necessarily to change your mind unless you want to. But to just wonder why somebody thinks that, what values led them to that conclusion, what experiences have they had, I think is so enriching. And I would encourage everybody to take a moment for curiosity and see what you can learn.
Well, Shira, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you. It was great to be with you.